evening, everyone. I'm going to call to order our SEAC meeting for Thursday, January 22nd, 2022. I will start with our land acknowledgement. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas or Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. I'd also like to read out the DDSB Human Rights and Equity Statement. The Durham District School Board is committed to learning environments that are safe, welcoming, respectful, equitable, accessible, inclusive, and free from discrimination while placing human rights and equity at the center. I'd like to also welcome our guests online who are following us online on YouTube today. And we will begin with our roll call, starting with Autism Ontario.
Present.
Black Parent Support Group.
Carissa Lewis here, present.
Great, thank you. Tara? I think.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I see Tara.
Tara Cully, Down Syndrome Association, Durham Down Syndrome Association.
Sorry about that. Early Years Consortium.
Vera Mercier.
Okay, thank you. Easter Seals Ontario is Hannah, and unfortunately she's had to step back. I don't think her alternate is online. Oh, sorry. Christina, you're there? Sorry.
Hi,
thank you. My
Christina
apologies. Okay. Learning Disabilities Association of Durham Region. Okay, Rowan must not be on yet. Member at Large, McClellan? Do we have Carolyn here?
Carolyn McClellan. Yep.
We have regrets from Donna Edge-Bean, our other member at large. Ontario Association for Families of Children with Communication Disorders.
That's me, Elizabeth Daniel for OAFCCD.
Okay, Voice for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children. Okay, I don't see Kathy online. Association for Bright Children is myself, Eva Kyriakides, and SEAC Chair. And we will go over to our administrative reps, starting with our elementary school.
From DISA, David Robson, Principal Dr. S.J. Phillips.
Great, thank you. And
also from DISA, Tammy Rayner, Principal at Sherwood.
Okay.
Rima Sati, Vice Principal at Carruthers Creek Public School in Ajax.
Excellent. And then our secondary school rep.
For DSAA, Anthony Phelan, Vice Principal at Henry Street.
Great. Okay. And then moving on to our staff.
System Lead for Inclusive Student Services, Kyla McKee.
Okay.
System Lead for Inclusive Student Services, Connor Jenkinson.
Okay. And sorry, go ahead, Ed.
Andrea McCauley, Superintendent of Inclusive Student Services.
Okay. And our trustees?
Donna Edwards, Trustee for Ajax Ward 3, and Darlene Forbes had sent her regrets.
Yes, I received regrets from Darlene. Okay. I think that is everybody. Before we move to the approval of the agenda, I just want to make an addition before a couple of amendments before we do that. One would be to add for our open discussion period, discussing a nursing shortage, which is a letter we received from the DSBN. And then just adding to the correspondence, the calendars, the draft calendars, as well as the funding resource guide from PAC on SEAC and the letter received today from Lakehead. If everybody's okay with those additions, can we have a motion to approve the agenda? Elizabeth, seconded by Donna.
As amended, yes.
Yeah, as amended. Thank you. All in favor? Okay, approved. Okay, has everybody had a chance to review the minutes from our December meeting? And if so, any questions or concerns with respect to those minutes? No? Okay, if we could then get a motion to approve the minutes from our December 16th, 2021 meeting. Tara Cully, any seconders? Christina Salisbury, all in favor? Okay, motion passed. And so we will move on then to the staff report, starting with the administration report.
Thank you so much. Currently being in the third week of January, we have already moved through multiple phases of school and childcare for both students and families in short time. So just going back over the time since we've been together as SEAC right before the December break. So over the December break, we did have a provincial announcement that delayed the start of returning to learning for 2 days. On that Monday, further announcement directed schools to move to remote learning until at least January 17th. And within that announcement, districts were given the opportunity for in-person learning for students with special education needs who cannot learn remotely. So together with Connor and Kyla and working with schools, schools did a phenomenal job of reaching out to families, really centering on the IEP goals, as well as the learning that both educators and kids have done through the different phases of the pandemic. Because each time we've moved to remote learning, the conditions have been different. And so that technology learning and the congruence with program outcomes and kids' IEPs keeps growing. And so we did have 45 learners across 21 different sites because we did keep the kids accessing in their schools. We didn't do any congregated sites at that point. 45 students accessed in person during that week. And then we all returned, or were supposed to return, to in-person learning on the 17th. Inclement weather resulted in the closure of elementary schools early this week and all of our secondary schools moving to virtual for 2 days. And through that time, DDSB at home continued to support students on their regular schedule. At this time, we're really proud and pleased that schools are back filled with the sounds of students, connections, and learning. And just a thank you to all of our families, educators, and school leaders for the incredible work at welcoming kids back after such a long period of time away from each other and the joy that that brings. So families and caregivers continue to navigate choices for their children. And so at this time, elementary families in the DDSB are able to select and signal a desire to move between in-person and DDSB at home for the second term. So that closes tomorrow night at midnight. And teams will be analyzing the survey responses and making programming and staffing decisions through next week. And that also includes, again, with Connor and Kyla, we'll be looking at considerations for students and their needs specific to where they're moving and if there's intersection with IPRC placements as well. So we'll be doing that. As a district, we do understand that some families may be choosing to keep their children home at this time or are required to isolate due to illness or exposure to COVID-19. So as a short-term measure, and again, signaled by the ministry as a requirement for boards as well, the DDSB is currently launched on Wednesday, providing students with limited temporary remote broadcast learning. So that gives students in grade cohorts an hour in the morning of broadcast, just like that says, non-interactive, but broadcast. And then again in the afternoon, a second hour with asynchronous or connection back to their classrooms outside of that. That moves through to mid-February at that transition point. So when families will either move or kids stability, and the short-term temporary remote broadcast will end at that time, with elementary students either further moving into DDSB at home or returning to their in-person learning at that time. So that's a lot, right, for just under 3 weeks of schooling, and just appreciation for the number of changes that brings for our kids. I imagine a lot of them, and heard from colleagues and friends that have students that were excited on Monday morning to have that crush of not being able to be with the people that they love at school. And so we just bring a couple points and highlights of gratitude from the past few weeks as well. So first of all is the flexibility and resilience of kids and families has just been amazing. We do a shout out to our Make a Difference team that is staffed with volunteers who continue to ensure that families have access to food and clothing resources. Super important there. Shout out to our Inclusive Student Services team who quickly pulled together a full day of drop-in sessions for educators this Monday. So when school closures got announced, within an hour, our team had drop-in sessions up and running to support teachers on the congruence between report cards and IEPs, and just do some general support around that, which was fantastic. The Innovation Technology team continues to support those sessions, as well as be foundational in broadcast learning along with our curriculum partners. And then our final one, and really super important, is we acknowledge with immense appreciation the work of our DDSB facility services teams. In schools, our custodians continue to invest great care in cleaning of schools, and they absolutely shone Monday and Tuesday with the care for sites and getting them ready for safe return. Our central facility services staff have moved 2,040 HEPA filters into learning spaces, and a team was in Friday night and over the weekend assembling COVID testing kits for distribution to schools. So just a lot of big team effort across the district, centered on students and families, which is quite inspirational when you see all the different areas and where that's moving, both in schools and district teams. So just a final prompt, and Eva mentioned and referenced in the update to the correspondence, that your input as SEAC is really important. So we do encourage you to take the opportunity to look at the draft calendars for the 22-23 school year and send in any feedback that you have. That will be collected across the district. It's also going to pick. So since a RENEB, you might get that twice. And so welcome it through both committees or either. And then we'll be collating that and taking it back prior to our report back to the trustees to seek permission to submit to the ministry. So that's how that process works. So that concludes our administrative report for January.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Does anybody have any questions for Andrea with respect to the administrator's report? Oh, Tara, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure this, in some of the, let me start again. It's been a day. Sorry, everyone. So it's sort of tying into the community concerns and comments. So I don't know if I should leave my comment until later in the agenda or specifically addressing one of the points that Andrea had brought up today. So whatever the committee would prefer.
I would suggest if Andrea's brought it up already and it ties into Andrea's report, I would ask it now, and then that way we keep the sort of continuity of it.
Fair enough. Okay. So I know we talked about the number of students in person and the whole delay and all of that sort of stuff. Sort of talking through that, I received a couple of conversations with some parents about how those discussions went, and with their children in small class placements and previous, placement discussions based on other previous lockdowns. They felt like it was a very high pressure sales scenario where it was, we weren't really interested in the student's best interest. This is what we were told we have to do. And what's really best for our child is the secondary option. And I just wanted to sort of bring that one up because I know we did not have very many. You said we had 45 of our students in person across all of them. I'd even go so far as, did we even have any considerations or discussions about, there are just some classes that just really don't work virtually. And should that have been a consideration with the conversations in the schools? And I know health and safety and those sorts of things, but we're sort of kind of going to have to live with this. We're almost in sort of endemic status at this point. COVID's not going away. We can't keep reverting back to the most conservative option all the time, especially if we're talking 2 years now where children's learning has been very, very much disrupted. We have to try and keep that continuity for the kids as well, for their mental health, as well as their learning and being able to become contributing members of society over time. How are we, that's really what I wanted to sort of address, saying that messaging seemed to have gotten skewed, I'm going to say, in some of the parents that I've spoken to. And even I, when I had my discussion with my son and my son's teachers as well, it felt like I had to really push for in-person and for something that, and it sort of seemed like they were very begrudgingly going for that. And I know that's not the intention of what we're trying to do, but that was some of the messaging that I got. And I wasn't, and I got it from multiple sources. So I'm sort of looking, going, how much messaging was really done there. And I'm worried about the parents that aren't as strong advocates for their children, that just went along with it, even not knowing what their options are, and then really saying what they really wanted for their children. And those are my sort of comments on that. So thanks.
Eva, do you mind? Thanks. So thank you for that, because the intention is never, like, those are entered into as collaborative conversations. So if anybody felt pressured, certainly apologies for that. I think your point around, I'm just going to break it apart a little bit, if that's all right. So the comment, and we'll take it kind of as the cluster of students and then bring it to the individual experience. So the comment around program types. So when we look at outcomes, I think the whole team, as well as the administrators, and I would imagine most of the association reps would say, one, the relationships matter, and all of the programs run best in a shared space. And that's the ideal, right? Is people all together as a classroom community, because of all of those nonverbal pieces that are so much better, and the relationship pieces, the kids being able to share space a bit. There's a total different navigation of conversation and communication when it's a group structure versus us being tiled on screen. Like we feel it as SEAC, right? In terms of that as well. So we would say yes, best in person. And that's what we did the first phase of remote back last January, because I was going back through notes, and we moved 3 of the program types and said, we're offering to Dev PLP and SLC, so structured learning, practical learning, and developmental. Here's the opportunity to come in person, let us know. And really that takes a more global than individualized approach, and really the ministry direction. And we came through. And so we didn't do that in the spring. We went individualized. And our indication on Omicron, very different again. So when we look at, as we've moved through different phases of the pandemic, the conditions have changed. We also knew coming into January that what was different was we had a lot of youth being hitting that point for second vaccination. We had different access points for staff, including third vaccinations. We knew there was different masking pieces coming in, such as the non-fit N95. So a lot of the conditions, as well as what you hinted towards, the endemic nature of this variant versus the pandemic previous. And really the intention of the school closures was to get that period to kind of get through that hump so we could all come back in. So the messaging really was, if we all kind of do that, we can actually come back in sooner in that regard. And that threshold for students who cannot learn remotely is it is a slim sliver in terms of short term. So I know our leaders on screen, as well as Connor, Kai, and myself, a lot of our conversations centered on a plan for that week. And if the at least part of at least January 17th was lived, there was a whole lot of conversations we were revisiting. So with a lot of families, it was, this is manageable on these sections and focus of the IEP for these days. But if we're into past the 17th, and we had even signaled it with the senior team, we would be in a completely different situation and revisiting a significant amount of those conversations. Because I think there's a difference and wariness of a long-term remote versus a short-term health-based piece to that. So that was kind of where the conversation centered. We did use very similar criteria back to the same thing we did in the spring. But again, the learning of kids and staff in terms of moving those pieces virtually were a bit different. We've also had a couple of those programs, specifically practical learning and developmental, running through DDSB at home since September. So when we look at, do we have learning about how to do life skills and developmental through a remote or virtual format? We didn't have that learning last year. And when we look at hand over hand and life skills programs, quite hard to translate onto on-screen programs. But we have teams doing that for kids, and we learned a lot from them. So the DDSB at home team immediately had put together resources to help the in-person that were shifting to remote on some structures and strategies that have been working for the kids and families with feedback on how to do that in the short term intervention with the intentionality of what the remote learning was meant to do in terms of getting all the kids back in school. So I wouldn't want families feeling pressured, but lots of complexities. Also too, that's why we want it centered on the IEPs and the conversation about individual students, because then it became about individual goals, individual commitments and strategies, and what part for 5 days, or if we were into longer. And just taking a look at that, I think too, as a board, we do need to always recognize that I believe we're either the largest or second largest employer in the region. And so there's lots of intersect with when we bring staff into buildings or kids into buildings, that there's all of those different relationships and crossover. And when we're in a pandemic into endemic, that all factors in. And so we really wanted to uphold the direction, because that was the direction, was remote learning with this small exception, in order to get all of our kids back into buildings sooner, inclusive of those that need that more intensive alt program. But I would never want a family feeling pressured. So we apologize for that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Tara. Did you want?
No, I mean, I pretty much expected that, because there are layers of complexity, which, most of the time you don't get in those conversations between a parent and the teacher, just simply because I sitting here, I see where all that's going. So that's the piece that's there. I think that was the challenge that I think that some of the conversations that I had heard, like there was one parent that had actually said, well, going back in person is, an option. It's just not the preferred option. And that child had already been in person before in the last lockdown. So again, the parent was very confused and very, upset that the conversation had to have again. They had to have that same conversation again. There was no sort of discussion of, well, the situation has sort of changed, so we've got to be a little bit more, sort of forthcoming. It was, my child has not changed. My child's needs have not changed. My child's ability to be virtual is not changed since the last time we were in lockdown. So I think that was where their frustration was kind of coming in. And I'm like, okay, I'll mention and say where's the other lenses coming in. Yeah.
And fair, except for the context of considerations that Do the Wraparound did, such as the learning about how to. And I think the other piece to it too is there are families that were offered in person that declined out of fear and concern, and just wanting that extra week or two in order to get in a safe space. So that was part of it too, right? I think there was families in both situations. So within that 45, it would have been a bit higher, not by a lot. I'm not saying that's a massive group, but there were families that declined in person.
And rightly so. That is a personal choice, again, for every family as well. So yeah. Okay. No, thank you. I'll bring that back.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions with respect to the administrator's report? No? Okay. Then we will move on to the board report with Donna.
Good evening. It's been busy as well for the Board of Trustees, but nowhere as busy, and we acknowledge the amount of work that our staff has done to get to where we are, where we had in-person learning. It's a bit of a juggle when you have announcements that are made by the Ministry of Education with really no detail. And as Andrea said, she mentioned a packaging of rapid antigen testing, and you receive them in 5, yet you're giving them out in 2, and then you need instructions to go with this. So kudos to the staff to get that out. And the same with masking. We receive masks for students, but they're not in small sizes, so they don't fit our young students. So what do we do with that masking? So, I mean, you know, the intentions are there, but when it comes down to really getting and fulfilling those promises that the government made our staff, that has worked very diligently to push it out. And again, kudos to them. It's just, it's really frustrating. The same around, you know, HEPA filters, which is the latest thing. Everybody keeps on telling, you know, oh, well, the government has put out all this money into HEPA filters. And there's this understanding that, but there's still guidelines on the distribution of those, the HEPA filters and the HEPA filtration systems units. In that, you know, there's guidelines by the Ministry of Education that they will be put in non-mechanical ventilated schools and kindergarten spaces first. And then after that, we're dealing with the situation. And we nowhere near have enough ventilation, the HEPA ventilation units, individual ones, to put in every classroom. And we don't have the budget to get them. And then there's also then the supply. So issues that you have because everybody's getting them. So again, we do have basically HEPA filtration units, ventilation units in each of the kindergarten classes. All the mechanical ventilated schools are been fitted with MERV 13 filters and so forth. So it's just that, you know, what is reported from the ministry and how it looks like in the schools is very, very different. And who makes that difference is our staff. And they've been working very hard in difficult situations. And so we had, as far as, you know, impacts to student, we did have a special board meeting and a discussion and a motion was passed to have masking for include our kindergarten students. Then as far as board is concerned, we had reports on the renaming of 2 schools. One was for Sir John A. Macdonald, and the board passed that the name would change based on community input to now. I might have to ask staff who have a better idea of how to pronounce the name, because if you, the way it is, if I were phonetically try to pronounce it, it's not pronounced the same way as read on the paper, but my understanding it is something like Pathology or something like that, but somebody could correct me wrong. But Josephine Mandamin Public School, and she is a Ashnita Bay elder and world-renowned water advocate, and a residential school survivor. She basically is has dedicated her life around speaking to the Great Lakes and about the Earth's water. It will be a huge sort of learning experience for everybody within the school to learn about Josephine Mandamin and about how, especially with some of the concerns that we have today around the earth and the environment, there's just so much learning potential. So it's a great to see that name change. And then I'll just make, does anybody, I apologize so profusely, how to pronounce that name?
Visages Mandamin Public School, and we can putting it in the box, but we will also, it was highlighted on CTV last night as well as CBC last night. Some beautiful narratives honoring her work as an Indigenous leader and water protector. and the connection with her husband in giving permission to honor the school with the opportunity to be named in her reflection. And her name means leading light. And so I think there's so many beautiful connections for the kids and the community. So if SEAC's interested in learning a bit more, we will share the reference to the board report, and there's a beautiful piece in there around honoring it. Her husband has asked that we use her Indigenous name rather than Josephine, so it did change from the consultation into the final decision, which is also a very significant honor for that invitation. And so we're just really honored. So we'll share the history and also maybe invite a member of our Indigenous education team in the next couple of months to come give some of the perspective just on the consultation that goes into that, as well as the depth of incredible learning. And perhaps we'll invite Paul Haynes, who is the principal, to come talk about what's going to happen at the school over the next few months as they prepare to shift the name for September.
And just a note, because I would hate to mangle the pronunciation of the name if they could actually put phonetic spelling beside it for in communications, because that is a common comment that we have had across the board, and I don't want to be disrespectful in constantly pronouncing it wrong until I get used to the pronunciation.
Yeah, I understand. I believe that putting a colonial phonetic spelling would actually be received as disrespect. Like we'll share a link on where individuals can access a vocal measure for that in terms of where. Because I think I
see it disrespectful of pronouncing it wrong all the time. So and it's I don't know its way, and I understand if we can't do that. But I don't want to be disrespectful and constantly pronouncing the name incorrectly.
No, absolutely. We'll share a resource. But I do believe that putting a colonial phonetic structure beside it would.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
As far as that's concerned, but okay. And then the second one was, of course, we had the renaming of Julie Payette, and that was not passed by the board. We also had a lot of information around the finance and the budget, and of course the budget process will start coming up fairly soon. We had a report on bell time reviews, and as far as the report can be accessed through in the agenda for the board meeting. And there will be public consultation that will be held around the bell time review, but we are also looking at other options in that. Partially the reason why the bell time review is happening is because of the fact that we still can have shortage of bus drivers to provide the number of routes that we currently are taking, or supply bus drivers, and the amount of disruptions that may happen if we cannot get bus drivers for those routes. And I know that I think this week there was one bus route that was canceled because they did not have a bus driver, and what that has an impact on students. So it's a matter of trying to deal with that, as well as scheduling the bell times. That's one option. We also had a preliminary discussion. Board members had a preliminary discussion with Durham Region Transit and the positive and lowering bus fares, etc., for secondary students. However, there is an issue that just replacing having the secondary students take Durham Region Transit, it still would not necessarily decrease the number of routes in order to accommodate the elementary and the changes that might have to happen there, plus include our special education routes for students of small classes. So we are going to continue to have that dialogue with them. and so forth. But there will be community consultations, and it's really, really important to get the word out and people look at the times from that perspective. Then let's see, and I think there was something like 40 some schools that were bell times that were affected across the board, and some and the trigger of the bell time review and public consultations is for any school over 10 minutes. Let's see, what else? Of course, we did review the calendar and basically distribute it for consultation and go through that process. It will go back to the board to be approved by the board, but ultimately it still goes back to the ministry to approve all board calendars. And as I said, we had budget information, capital project information, and which there's a lot of details around the expenses and updates as far as program funding, priority program funding that was sent to boards. And I think that's about it. That's my report.
Thank you, Donna. Does anybody have any questions for Donna with respect to the board report? No? Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on then to our Inclusive Student Services report. Over to you, Kyla.
Good evening, everyone. Connor and I are going to share a report this evening, and hoping that the screen did change and we just see a summary of the slides. SEAC does have a copy of all these slides, and we're just going to highlight a couple of them for you, knowing that you have them for your reference. The first one, and hopefully this will click and do what it's supposed to do. There we go. So again, knowing that you have access to the information here, just this is really about the reminders as we continue to move through COVID-19 and recognize that for each family, those experiences will be individualized, that there are a number of supports available. And this was a tweet that I saw on many different social media platforms over the last couple of weeks, but just highlighting it for SEAC as well to make sure that we can continue to share with families who are reaching out to you that there are a number of ways that we can provide some support. And so just highlighting that for your attention. The main highlight from my end, and then Connor will highlight a second one, was this tremendous event. So SEAC may recall that on an annual basis, we host a grade 8 to grade 9 event to support parents and families of students who have IEPs who are in grade 8 transitioning to grade 9. We know that for all of our families, but particularly those that this may be their very first grade 8 student who's moving on to secondary, that this can be a very stressful and anxious time. And so we wanted to ensure that we continue to maintain the opportunity to share information and connect. It's an amazing partnership between the Student Success Department and team and our Inclusive Student Services team, because a great deal of the content that's in the presentation has to do with course selection and helping families understand. This was a little bit more complicated going into September than it has been even in the past, in that there are now some new courses being offered called inclusive courses for grade 9, as well as de-streamed courses. And so we spent some time explaining to families what the differences are between those pieces, but also identifying, and for SEAC's reference, that we do have a team of pathway counselors, and each of those counselors will meet with each of our grade 8 students to talk through and work through course selections in the coming weeks. And then we have our Choosing My Success documents. And so this was intended to just be an overview session and prepare families for what is the general information, so that when they move to their individual secondary school meetings, they have a good context to be able to draw from. They know what the structure of the school team will look like, because again, for some families, this is their first student moving into secondary school. And so simple differences like, is there a CERT at secondary? It's my go-to person at elementary. Is there one at secondary? And walking them through those types of things. So we had a tremendous registration of over 500 families. We had over 350 able to attend the actual event. And we have followed up because they submit an email address for each participant registered. We were able to follow up with them with a copy of the slide deck, a a recording of the event. And then throughout the evening, they posted some excellent questions. We did have some time within our evening to be able to respond to many of them, but we captured all of our answers and were able to share the question and answer document in an email for all registered participants. So not only was the event itself well attended with over 350 families, but then we've now reached out to anyone who may want reference to that as they move into their individual high school connections and meetings. There were 2 schools that may have been affected in terms of timing. So just for SEAC's notice that Ajax High has always done their event a little earlier than some of the other secondary schools. So this would have reinforced for those families those messages. But also the most important thing was making those connections with their school teams. And then Pine Ridge happened to have the exact same evening noted. So we were able to communicate to those families that they would be receiving these resources if they did register. But that also, it was a great opportunity for us to show Sade and Braden and the role that they can play in the coming years as well as part of pathway planning. So it was a really great event. We have done it centrally in person many, many times. Last year we recorded a session and shared just a recording of a slide deck for support. And so this year we felt that the opportunity to do a live event that was recorded was our ongoing learning about trying to maximize the virtual platforms to support families. So again, we received some very positive feedback, but also wanted to make sure that parents had some tangible resources to draw from after that meeting as they move into the really important and comprehensive transition meetings. And our timing is intentional. Our annual reviews for grade 8s typically happen in February. And so we wanted to ensure that families had this information before attending their child's grade 8 to grade 9 IPRC review. So lots of pieces to that event. And I believe SEAC has access. The links are live. And so you definitely have the ability to review the event, the slide deck, and the question and answer document. So we're more than happy to continue to share resources for your reference and support as well. And I'm going to hand it over to Connor, and I think he's going to cover this slide. Hopefully I'm right, Connor. If not, tell me to back it up.
No, you are absolutely correct, Kyla. Thank you. So I'm stepping in for Lisa Drake, who is our clinical lead and senior manager for our speech and language pathology team. So this project was a project that was leveraged through the Special Education Reserve funding that was accessed. It was an 8-week project right at the beginning of the school year. And the focus was to be able to bring in a single SLP, so a speech and language pathologist, to focus on the transition from the summer and into school and the school environment. So there were 11 students across the entire district who were able to be serviced directly by an SLP, and that was with an intense focus on being able to get into directly service those students on multiple occasions. So most of the students received a minimum at least 4 direct service appointments, and that included working directly with those educator teams or the educators in the classroom on how to build their own capacity on how to be able to look at trying to get those tangible gains to be able to access their communication. So as we can see, there were 2 specific goals that were there to increase communication, build educator capacity. So in terms of being able to increase or being able to increase communication, it was all around trying to be able to work through how to maximize those repeated or how to maximize those tangible goals. So that for some students, that was working with an augmentative communication system, and it'll be their own personalized augmentative communication system, supporting the educator team that was in place to be able to use that and have the student be able to access their voice right away. And the other point was also about trying to determine some functional communication to be able to understand for our students to be able to make gains very, very quickly so that they were able to start to work with some of the classroom. I will go to some of the data that was there. So the next slide that we'll see, there were students that were referred through the SLP team. So that was in our in-place team that was there. And as you can see, there were grades from senior kindergarten to grade 5, with the majority, as we can notice, making that transition between kindergarten to grade 1, which we know is such a critical transition for many of our students. And you'll see an acronym down there, and I had Lisa walk me through some of the acronym of a GAS goal. So it's a goal attainment scaling. And they work through at trying to be able to take some of those qualitative observations that a lot of our practitioners, our clinicians use, and being able to numerize and be able to make it into a quantitative scale. So you do see that there is a variety of supports that were used and a variety of accesses that students were able to be able to use. So you can notice that under the goals that were there, and they were individualized for the individual students as well. And what was noticed is that on a scale of 3 steps, that the average across most of the students, they were able to attain 1.8. So that is saying that they were able to get a good amount of time across that. There were some learnings that were taken from the project that Lisa and her team were to be able to take back. And there's lots of successes that they were able to see as well. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Connor. And that concludes our department report.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions with respect to the department report? No? Okay. Then we can move on to our open discussion period, which will focus on the nursing shortage. So earlier in the week, we circulated, or last week, we circulated a letter from the District School Board of Niagara with respect to the nursing shortage issue. And, there's a nursing shortage in many respects across the province in sort of every area. But for some of our kids, nursing at school is sort of a necessity for them to be there if they have complex medical needs. And so there's some issues with that. I know, and I'm sure our board is similar to the Niagara board, where they're doing their best to kind of work with parents, to have parents come in or somebody come in to help sort of fill those gaps when they can't find nursing, which is not necessarily ideal, and not necessarily feasible for a lot of families too, especially if parents are working. They sort of highlighted that while the ministry, sort of expanded the requirements, or sort of to qualify for the family managed home care and self-directed care program, it's very difficult for families to sort of navigate that system and to receive funding for it. There's a lot of, cross communication between ministries that's causing a bit of a problem. I know, Donna, you had some questions with respect to that. I don't know if you want to speak to what you were looking at.
Actually, I had forwarded them on to Andrea, and I would just, Andrea, I know I provided me the answer, so I think it'd probably be beneficial if Andrea sort of talked about what the situation is here. As you mentioned, that the communications, or the lack of communications, or the difficulty of communications between around the funding and then between the board and the agencies is a huge issue, as well as, many times the board isn't really involved in some of the, especially when it comes to the funding. So it's either not a knowledge or even a privacy issue, right? So I think Andrea can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
Thanks. Thank you to both. So it's a complex piece. So there's nursing is one of those pieces that, unless you're involved in the support to a student and family, I'm thinking of our administrator colleagues on screen, until you have opportunity to be in that conversation, the complexity doesn't really surface, just in terms of the multi-ministry. So nursing is funded by the Ministry of Health. and it's funded for a couple different pieces. So we are funded for in-school care with a caveat to that, and families can access nursing for at-home services as well, because we know some of the kids and youth require 24/7 nursing care. So it becomes a really one that the school team needs to live in the sensitivity, and our school teams do an excellent job of doing this in understanding the pressures and the complexity for families that exists all the time for them. And so when we get into a nursing shortage, we have had some of our students impacted for their nursing support at school, but we're always cognizant that usually it's the same families that are also seeing unfilled shifts through the night. So often the parent or caregiver is now on call, and their health and well-being is pushed as well as they are providing essential support for their child. When it comes to nursing care at school, the funding holder is Home and Community Support Services. So many of you would recognize the acronym LIN, or the Integrated Health Network. That name changed over to Home and Community Care. And sometimes we'll refer to New LIN. I really want to be respectful of them as an organization and go Home and Community Care Services. So they hold the funds, and then those funds transfer to community partners. And most of our kids who have nursing support have it through community partners in nursing. That is our local contractor. And then some of, if community partners in nursing can't fulfill, then Home and Community Care has gone out to private nurses or different agencies as well. But we are fortunate in Durham that most of our nursing supports that are embedded in our classrooms come from one community partner. So that sets us a bit different than some boards and would be an asset. I think this fall it has been one of few assets in the challenge of supporting our kids in this regards. So where we are funded is if a student has a scheduled health support need. So that could be something such as G-tube feeding that occurs twice a day at scheduled times, or it could be a continual support such as airway monitoring. So if a student requires nursing care for airway monitoring or deep suctioning, so clearing of saliva beyond the larynx, a nurse could be in place full time, and that is provided and funded. If it's scheduled, such as the example of a G-tube feeding, that is scheduled. So it is funded and provided in terms of approval to fill a nursing complement. Where we have a gap that is not pandemic related, but process related, is if the nursing care need is not scheduled. So we increasingly, especially around kids that have physical complexity, but also mental health needs. So there's use of PRN, so pro Renata, or on-demand medications, which can be used sometimes around mental health needs, but where we really see the gap that we feel like we can advocate and push a bit more is around some of the seizure medications that must be delivered during a seizure, but the seizures aren't scheduled, obviously, for the kids. But for example, one of our students who, with non-identifying information, I use as an example to Donna, was a student who has multiple seizures daily. To me, we want to argue that that is regular and continual, but because the seizures don't occur at the precision of time every day, the Ministry of Health and Home and Community Care consider that not a health support, but a medical emergency, and flip the funding and say that's where emergency 911 services are funded, and it is not in-school nursing care that's funded for that. The funding would come and we would be expected to call one of our partners. The challenge is that when kids have seizure disorders requiring PRNs, the time between that medication determination, which is a medical decision, so we do not want board staff doing that. We are not medically trained in any role. The time interval matters, and paramedics can't come that fast. And for this individual student, it's multiple times a day in frequency with some pretty significant impacts long-term of if there's a time interval gap. So how we define regular and consistent is up for a bit of debate that we would like to have provincially. And then this fall, we've been compounded by our partners not necessarily being able to fill all the nursing shifts. We were offered the opportunity to hire nurses as a board. I feel that if we could find nurses, so could our partners. And then the nurses would have the guidance of a senior management team. A nurse practitioner cannot practice without that supervision piece. So for us, it would not just be a matter of bringing in a nurse. It would actually be adding those different layers. And really, our partners do a great job at it. We need them to be supported in doing that work in partnership with us. One of the pieces that we were really challenged with this fall is information. So we work with, and again, partnerships are developing, but this is just a very overt challenge. And it was when we pick kind of, the arguments or advocacy that we're going to lean into. We leaned into this one, I think, Kyla, pretty hard this fall. So we asked for our district data. We asked for the list of students who qualified for in-school nursing care. So not home care. That's not our purview. If a family has intermittent but scheduled care that they can schedule outside of the school day, that's not in our purview unless the family wants to share it. But what we asked for is, could you please tell us, and this was back in August, can you give us a list of students that qualify for in-school nursing care so that we reach out to administrators, we can reach out to community partners in nursing, and just make sure that these pieces are all in place for kids, recognizing that the family would have to give consent. PHIPAA applies. This is personal health information, but there's a way to do it. And the response was that we had no right to know district data, that we could reach out to our school administrators and survey and get that from them, because the case managers would be speaking to the families who would also be calling the schools and letting them know. So that means that when I look at my duties as superintendent under the ED Act and the portfolio opportunities and challenges of inclusive student services, I feel like it's a barrier to me being able to do my job and uphold the commitment to the kids and families. And so we pushed, including our own ministry, and asked for a reach over between the Ministry of Ed and the Ministry of Health to release the data to us at a district level. Because quite honestly, when I look at colleagues on screen, it shouldn't be Dave telling me if one of his kids has nursing care. We should both be finding out in order to plan for that. And so the pushback was around privacy information. And no, we could not, because the data transfer has a risk. The challenge to that is Grandview Kids is also a Ministry of Health funded provider. And we've talked around the SEAC table how Grandview is our provider for school-based rehab services, including OT, PT, and speech. Speech is a regulated health profession as well. And we get data from Grandview. And so to me, that argument of an MOH or Ministry of Health partner not being able to share data with us, and we were expecting that the appropriate consents would be in place to share it. The parent caregiver voice is absolutely essential in this. But given that foundation of consent, the not being able to work with privacy and get data, I'm challenged to accept that when our Grandview Kids partner regularly, at least twice a year, gives us full data in terms of numbers and the who. And does so in a way that very much upholds PHIPAA and MFIPA. So we continue to work on this because Donna asked the question, how many kids have been impacted and different things. And the answer is, from what we know, this is the answer. And that's not a comfortable place to be as someone who works in student learning and well-being and advocates for some of our most vulnerable kids. I like to know where the kids are, and I like to know that they have the services that they need. And for a large part of September, we were kind of trying to figure that out with schools, and I don't think that's good leadership, and I don't think it's fair on families. I think it puts additional pressures on families for communication when they should expect that an approval for school-based nursing is communicated with the school, and the school's proactively doing some planning to embed nursing care in the schools. Where nurses are in classrooms, it's very much a team approach. One of the other pieces we've asked for is for a nurse who's assigned to one student to actually serve multiple kids if the service to the students warrants it. So for instance, if one student has intermittent feeding, And another one has deep sectioning, but the scheduling can be done. Don't send 2 nurses into one classroom. Have 1 nurse do both services, if possible, and that might be some efficiencies that way. So we're just looking that there's different pieces. I have a hard time when inefficiency impacts our kids. The data piece is big because we couldn't be proactive. And that's also hard, especially with the impacts. So did we have kids that were not able to attend because of a lack of nursing care and their health vulnerabilities related to that? We did. We still do have a couple. And then Donna's other question was around family managed home care and self-directed care and the processes around that. And again, if we can't get data about school-based nursing care as a district, we won't be able to get home-based data as well. I would imagine partners such as Easter Seals and things like that might have further insight just because of the families and the kids. But it has been a challenge for a number of ways. It's caused us to do some really creative thinking, which is really great as well. And in the end, did we apply some budget in order to move rightfully what should be in place for kids, such as I mentioned, that student who has seizures and we do need a nurse to attune. There is a nurse on site that does a half-day program. As a board, we are absorbing the other half of the day in order to get a nurse on site full-time for that student because it's rightful. His mom shouldn't be sitting in a parking lot in order to rush in, and that's what she was doing for the first couple of weeks of the school year. So from a family and student perspective, that's always where we're going to land. But there is some pieces that don't have to be the challenges that they are currently. Sorry to take up so much time on that. This one is quite near and dear. You're on mute, Eva.
Sorry, I thought I clicked that. Donna, I see your hand up, and then I would like to hear from Christina with respect to Easter Seals' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would too, but I was just going to comment that, I hate to sound like a broken record, but at the K-12 STC meeting, these issues came up regularly, and there are some recommendations in that report that talks about basically services provided by health professionals and other educational services, and about access to information and data and so forth in order to do the proper planning and process. And just the way things have fallen, etc. I know that the report has been completed. It's just being formatted and ready, and also translated into a French version and stuff, and eventually would go. But then we have a provincial election, and we would have to keep on pushing this. But it's really crucial because across the province, especially now with the shortage that is the nursing, across the province, there are students that are not. It was shared with me from another board that an individual who required nursing care, and we're talking exactly similar situations, but has not been at school for 2 years, has significantly impacted the families, mental health, everything, because that child has been at home for 2 years. And it's really sad to say. And so it is a crucial issue. It might be, if we look at small numbers, if you wish, that it may affect, but it has the impact is much greater in the life and the learning of this child.
Yeah, absolutely. Christina, you want to give us Easter Seals' thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we're planning to meet with Allison as well to discuss it a bit more, right? But it's definitely impacting our families as well. And we're hearing the same issues, and it's province-wide, unfortunately, as well, right? So there's kids, even with very minimal nursing needs who are not getting the service and not attending the school, right? So kids, even with, for example, diabetes, who may not have any other disabilities or medical needs that are not even able to get that one visit at lunchtime, right? So parents are having to either choose to keep their child home or, go into school at lunch, which then, of course, then they can't work necessarily, right, as well, right? And kind of be on call if there's, an emergency and that kind of thing. So it's impacting our families for sure, and something that we're aware of and hoping. I don't know how much we can do to help, but we're definitely going to push, right? And so not much good news or anything, but we're aware of it, right? Their families are definitely impacted, and it's gone on 2 years now with no changes, right?
Yeah. Senator Arnab, I see you have your hand up.
I hear this problem, and I can see my families who have children who fall into these categories and the struggle that they are going through. But when Andrea was talking about that data collection to become proactive in the problem, I'm wondering if there is a way that we can capture that data collection starting in the next school year. Is there something that we can add to school registration or the classroom consultation meetings that will allow parents to sign those consents at that time so that the information is shared? Is there a way that we can fix this for the future?
Eva, is that okay? So I always love your problem solving and creativity and centering on the kids. So the challenge doesn't lie with between families and schools. So typically, when we're into students that have that complexity of needs, whether it be for well-being, health, like catheterization or something like that, or more intensive like airway monitoring, usually families are very forthright, and actually it's critical. It's actually essential and life-sustaining for many of these kids. So families have a lot to share with the school that's really important to be heard and early. The challenge is that comes in individually by school. And in a system our size, it's not reaching out to 20 administrators saying, has anybody heard from nursing or families? In a district our size, we started September with nursing care at 39 schools based on the breadth of programming. And I think it's credit to our schools in terms of really honoring learning and well-being in all of its definitions, and why families trust us with kids. That it has to be pretty scary, especially in a pandemic, to send to school sometimes. So it comes in individually, but where I think we lose integrity as a system and being able to mobilize support is, I don't want to send out a survey to principals in September and say, hey, has anybody heard, or what's your data? Because I think administrators should expect that we know, and that we've been proactive in communicating with our community partners, and that we have a plan, especially when we have a department like Inclusive Student Services that should be essentially the knowledge keeper of those processes. Because if I'm a principal that I go into a school and I've never had a student with nursing supports, there's a lot of learning to do around the relationship, the management of the nurse, what happens if the student's away, who notifies the nursing company. There's a lot of things that if you don't have nursing care in your school, we take off your plate as an administrator. And so it layers on when you need it for a student or more. It's not a question we should be asking our administrator. It's something that system to system we should have in place in support of the kids, in support of the families and school teams. So the data from the family is not the issue. We should be able to get district data because how do we know if a nurse is absent or not? Well, we need to know if there should be one in the first place and share that. So yeah, and I don't want the families to report in centrally because the relationships need to sit at the school with the adults that are going to be with the student, and that trust piece being developed at the school. So I would never want to take that away centrally or have families share beyond who they're comfortable sharing with. It's an oxymoron, right? It's a twist of.
I mean, having cared for a senior for a number of years as a power of attorney, I understand why there's privacy information put in place. However, sometimes there's not a thought given to the consequences of some of the decisions that are made. And that the very people you think you're seeking to protect, you're hurting. You can be hurting. And I know that directly with my grandfather. I was fortunate to have the power of attorney. Had he not had the foresight to do that, we would have had some very serious problems in getting him things he was rightly entitled to through the Veterans Affairs because of privacy information or like privacy legislation. So this problem extends to many areas of people who are vulnerable, unfortunately, right? I think we have a situation right now where we are heading towards an election very quickly. Each party has a critic for each ministry that matches the ministry, right? One of the things on the court draft correspondence that you guys probably noticed, we sort of put in there, I stuck in sort of copying those critics, the education critic, the health critic, etc., so that it's not just brought to the attention of the minister, in charge of the portfolio, but we're bringing it to the attention of the shadow cabinets as well of the other parties in order to really shine a light on it. Because we send a letter, I feel, just to the minister responsible. They go, "That's nice," and they file it. But what's best way to get that out in the out in the public sort of forum or in debated within the legislature, or the Queen's Park, is to send that to the shadow ministers who start to see a problem and start bringing it up and asking questions, because, otherwise it gets sort of filed. And, we've been we're in a bit of a letter writing spree as it is. What's another letter, right? To sort of draw attention to this stuff, because I think it's really important, and we're starting to really see a pattern of the lack of availability of services across the province for our most vulnerable, right? And this pandemic has really highlighted so much of that, and the burnout amongst nurses has been so strong that so many have left the profession as well. And I think it's stuff that we need to address and sort of shine a light on, because I don't think people often think about that. When they're thinking of nursing shortages, they're thinking about hospitals, right? They're not thinking about schools. They're not thinking about that child that's impacted. And I know myself, a good friend of mine who has a very medically fragile child, and I haven't touched base with her in a while. I don't know what the situation with nursing is, because again, they're 24-hour nursing, and I can't imagine for them how that would be if they were missing a piece of that puzzle, because it's hard. So, Elizabeth?
I was just thinking about it from the concept of circle of care, because if you're allowed to share healthcare information in order to facilitate the provision of healthcare, I wonder if it's worth digging into that, the definition of circle of care, and whether or not there could be some sort of request to privacy commissioner about whether or not school boards would fall into that, and whether or not the privacy commissioner could act as an ally in trying to rectify this gap.
Eva, through you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Suggesting next step on this one, picking up on Elizabeth's comment, and I think giving Christine an opportunity to touch base within Easter Seals as well, just so we can do alignment on messaging. What you could do is ask staff to consult with our in-board council on Elizabeth's suggestion. And then that would give Christina maybe a chance to go back to Easter Seals. It'll give staff a chance to check with Council Cotter on Elizabeth's suggestion around the privacy commissioner. And definitely that plan of care is language we are certainly mirroring. But that's an very interesting lens around health. So if you wanted to ask staff to do that, I'd be happy to take that back, and then would be asking Christina as partner to go back to Easter Seals and just what Easter Seals is mobilizing in terms of advocacy as well, as it certainly falls in their domain, but at direction and will of committee.
That's an excellent idea. Elizabeth, did you want to make a motion to ask admin to seek clarification from their council, from board council?
I would like to make a motion about that.
Okay. Anybody want to second that motion? Spencer and F. All in favor? Motion is passed unanimously, I believe. Okay. And then maybe we can revisit this again, next month and then talk about sort of where we go from there. Okay. Does anybody else have anything to add to that before we move on? I don't want to not give anybody a chance to speak. No? Okay. Then we are going to go on to the business arising from the minutes, and Lisa circulated on our behalf with great appreciation from us our two draft letters so far. One with respect to the special incident portion funding and the serious decrease of the increase that happened previously when this government first took over, and our request to have that reinstated, as well as sorry, Don, I am blanking for a minute on our other second letter.
It's basically changed the definition of disability and supporting Bill 172.
Changing the definition of disability to sort of, match across the legislation, so we can stop adding individual sort of diagnosis each time to legislation, such as the fetal alcohol syndrome legislation. There is also one more letter in the works with respect to the sort of discussion we had with some of the information that sits on the IEP that goes to the teachers on the front page. And we are still looking for some more information on that. And we'll have a draft letter out to SEAC. If we actually have it ahead of time, we may send it out sort of mid-month just for sort of input and comment to finalize at our next meeting. With respect to the first two letters, did anybody have any comments or suggestions with respect to those letters? Anything that they think should be added or changed? Sorry. Yeah, Donna, go ahead.
It's just a comment because, I need a bunch of eyes on it because I was involved with drafting it, but just a comment, especially when we received, and I know we'll talk a little bit later, but the pack on SEAC on budget process. It was interesting that there was a comment in there that SEACs do not know what proposed funding is until the GSNs are received. And so, like, I'm sitting there going, because here we are talking about special incident, but this particular one is really talking about the increase that was proposed in 2018, but we did not get that increase when it came around. They actually decreased the amount that was provided to board significantly. But it's just interesting because even when it comes to our proposed budget, we don't really get things finalized, honestly, until we actually get enrollment, right? And then we submit cases for SIT. So it's just sort of a catch-22 situation there as far as I'm concerned. But I thought that was very interesting that, boards, SEACs don't know what the funding is until the GSNs are submitted. Well, actually, we don't really know until the next fall when everything enrollments are done. But Anyways, but I think that this letter still could go. I'm just questioning timing. Do we send it now, definitely before the GSNs are submitted, or do we wait until but the grants for student needs are usually not provided. They say that they are going to be on time, but we know in the past that I think last year it was May that we got the technical paper, the grants for students needs. And I don't know if we want to wait that long. So that's my only, was when do we really want to see? Do we want to send it out now, or do we want to wait till we see the GSN? But I'm just cautious, just the way things are working. We keep on getting promises and we don't get them when we're supposed to.
Yeah, my perspective on that is that, one of the reasons I think we got the initial, the increase back in sort of 2018, that was announced sort of in the spring, heading into an election, right? That where we finally, after many letter writing campaigns across the province, they finally increased it $11,000, only to have the current government come back in and say, "Oh no, we'll let you keep 1,500 of that," and roll it back afterwards, right? We're heading into another election, and I would doubt that if we miraculously convince them to do the right thing and reinstate that $11,000 increase, that either one of the other two parties, should they win, would roll that back. So I'm inclined to sort of bring that back up as again, copying the shadow cabinet ministers, to try and get that on the radar ahead of an election, because so much is being overshadowed by COVID, right? That I feel like the only way you're going to really get a lot of attention is if we try to find a way to get it out there, sort of somehow break the COVID fog and get people sort of paying attention, realizing there's a lot of other issues actually going on, probably more than most people realize, and not just in education. So, that's sort of my perspective on it. I feel like the sooner we get it out there, the longer. And if other boards kind of pick up on what we've done, especially copying the shadow ministers, and they start doing it, and a flurry of these letters start coming in to all sides, that we have a better chance of sort of, creating a media story around it. So it's sort of my perspective on it. Anyway. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that. No? If nobody has anything to add or anything they'd like to change on the letters, I'd like to sort of, have them approved by SEAC. Oh, sorry, Tara, go ahead.
Sorry, I think we were just talking about the other letter. So I was looking at the definition of disability one. And I'm a little, what's the intent of why we want to change the definition? So the sort of final step, if we change the definition, this recommendation would curtail, if not completely stop, the number of requests to change the legislation as it covers current. So that's not really the point. So it's not you're going to stop getting angry letters. It's now you have a very consistent definition. So now we can start applying consistent service, right? Like, do we need to make that sort of clear? It's not that you're just going to stop getting angry letters from us. It's now you have a definition which you need to be, held accountable to. Like, so then it's consistent and everyone has that same definition, that same understanding. Like, we need to add something to that sort of language in there.
So in it, we talk about, people asking for legislation to be changed to add a new diagnosis or disorder.
Yeah.
Right. In that letter. And that's what we're talking about. If they change the definition of disability, you won't need to have diagnoses, added, right? Because it would fall under that definition as well, right? It's sort of, our thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way, if there's a suggestion on better wording, yeah, please send it through.
Yeah, I'll think about that for a second, because I think it just sort of seems like if you do this, then we'll stop writing letters. I'm like, no.
No, yeah, no,
we're not going to stop writing letters. No.
But people won't have to write letters on adding diagnoses. Yeah, so maybe we add something to the effect of, letters requesting diagnoses be added to the legislation will be not necessary as the definition.
Now it provides that common framework, and now the focus can be on providing services that allow and include all aspects, all disability, under the broader definition. So rather than sort of cherry picking, this is disability. Yeah. You don't get anything because you don't qualify. Like that's the point. Yeah. We're trying to say it needs to be a much more inclusive, broader spectrum definition, so that people and programming and services and funding is available for those folks, and so that they're all given equal opportunities and equal sort of more equity in the process and in the system.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'll think about it and I'll spit something back out.
Perfect.
Okay.
I'm not sure who had their hand up there first, Andrea or Carolyn. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yes, I also can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I also had a few minor edits to the definition of disability letters. Can I send those to you?
Yeah, go ahead and send them to me. Yeah, okay. That would be perfect. That would probably be the easiest way, and then I can just quickly do them and get the letter finalized. Yeah, go ahead, Andrea. Perfect. Great. Thanks you so much, Carolyn.
So not to sound the same as a comment a minute ago, but offer again that because of the legislative nature of this and the crossover between different pieces of law, offer is that if it's at the direction of SEAC to do consultation with in-house counsel on the letter prior to approval to send, just for that different lens, because who you're sending it to will turn it to counsel. And sometimes counsel speaking to counsel is a different language. So it might be wise to have Council Cotter take an eye on this one, just knowing, Eva, to your comment about where does this go and what do they do with it? Because I imagine a response would not come in absence of council concept. So happy to do that if it's the direction of SEAC as well.
Donna, go ahead.
And what I don't want is to get it in left in this legal quagmire, as far as, because I can honestly tell you that if the change of definition is it has to go through the whole legislative process, et cetera, et cetera. It also will have effect on other legislations or regulations under the Act, including, IEP, et cetera, et cetera. But what really the incentive is to say, like, listen, guys, you really need to look at the definition so it's across the board. As Tara said, that it's inclusive. So I just caution that if we're going to go to that, we don't make it too legal speaking and get caught in the quagmire, because it really is to bring the attention to not only the current government, but the as Eva has said, is going to the other parties to say that, like, hey, this and it won't be a simple fix, but also just to note, it's also a recommendation under the K-12 SEAC. I'm feeling like a broken record here tonight.
Yeah. Does anybody have thoughts on what they want to do with respect to that? Like, I don't mind having legal take a look at it. But I think basically what we're asking is that the government really take a look at their definition, start to try and align things that becomes more inclusive, as opposed to continuously modifying legislation to add a specific identification. People shouldn't have to do that in order to get services, or for kids who clearly need services. Mm-hmm. So I guess do we want, what it comes down is, do we want to make a motion to have council take a look at it? If we do, can somebody make a motion for that? Yeah, Tara. Okay. Any seconders? Carolyn, all in favor? Okay. So yeah, we can have that if Andrew, if you don't mind asking council to take a quick look at it and just kind of maybe provide the lens of what we're looking at or why we're looking at writing this letter.
Perfect. Thank you. Can I ask that the amendments from Tara, I think Tara and Carolyn had amendments letter that I would ask that they be embedded first. And then we'll take the draft letter that SEAC is looking at just for a quick eye out with that.
So if you ladies would like to sort of send me your amendments to the letter, I'll incorporate that, sort of as soon as I have them, and then send it immediately on to Andrea. So the sooner the better. Maybe I can find a few minutes tomorrow and get that off to Andrea. Just because we'd like to get some of our issues sort of out there ahead of this election, right? So okay, we are moving on then to the association reports, and I know we have update. I think there was an intake letter that Senator Nab had sent and was circulated to SEAC. And maybe we could ask Senator Nab to give us her great synopsis of what's going on, because you're so good at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to report that the Entry to School program has now been launched. They have sent around invitation letters to families who have children up to 6 years old, and this will be their first time entering school. So your child can be in grade 1 to apply. The turnaround date is actually very quick. Did I take my thing off mute? I did take it off mute. The turnaround date is very quick. It's February 11th. They need parents' response if they would like to participate in this program. This program is going to happen for about 6 months, and it is a group-based program focusing on communication, play, social interaction, functional routines, behavior and self-management, and pre-academic learning and attention. What I'm hoping to see is if there is a change in some of the feedback we received from our inclusive student services for the children entering school next September. Is this allowing our children to be able to participate in more classroom routines, have healthy relationships, understand group dynamics, maybe requesting help or negotiation skills? I'd like to see if there are any beneficial effects of this program to how our education program runs next year.
Thank you so much. It'll be interesting to see. Go ahead, Andrea.
Senator Neb, did the program, when it was first in a proposal state, right, and it was supposed to be the 6 months prior to school start, but the funding was coming out to the community partners to hire staff who obviously don't work 6 months and then go on holidays for 6 months. And so one of the things that was being figured out is that kindergarten is not kind of continual entry and, well, it is for individual students, but not as a system. And that we don't really have a large 6 month entry point. Has that figured itself out at all in terms of how the program is being set up? Because that was a quandary in the original, that in the design of 6 months run up to school start, that kind of happens once a year.
Correct. So it only is September entry so far, right? I haven't been able to see which programs have been approved to run this program, because in my viewpoint, it would be a consulting agency that already possibly has relationships with these children, and then this program is just embedded in as another addition to the services that they run.
Perfect. So what I can do is a couple of our local partners did apply to be the provider of the entry to school program. And the board did, not the district, did write a letter of support advocating for those partners. So I'm happy to go back and share that letter with SEAC because it provides a little bit of the context of who was applying to be the providers. And then we would wait for confirmation of a public announcement on the outcome of that. But it would give a sense of who was seeking to be part of that in partnership with each other, which was quite powerful as well.
Before this was run through OAP, in my day-to-day work, we did run school readiness programs. Our school readiness program is a year in the making. So we start the fall before with parent information. Then now we're having consultations with the school, and then the sit-down class meetings in the spring, and then always the group-based programs during the summer. And yes, that left out children that applied in, say, February or moved into district during the school year, but it did capture the bulk of the students, right? And as this is in the pilot program, give as much feedback as you can, and hopefully those will affect the changes that we need to see.
Thank you. That was great information. Appreciate that. Does anybody have any questions for Senator Reneb with respect to the pilot project and the intake? Well, we appreciate you keeping us up to date. It's good information, and hopefully we do get some good feedback for the fall. So, okay. Moving on then to our correspondence. We did receive the calendar, so if you guys could take a look at that and provide any feedback you might have with respect to the proposed calendars for next year, would be great. The letter with respect to the support for Bill 172, which again is the fetal alcohol syndrome, that is really what our letter with respect to the definition of disability is talking about, is going to. We also received from PAC on SEAC funding a resource guide, which was circulated to SEAC. And there was also a letter from Lakehead Public School with respect to shortages of EAs and PSWs, etc. If anybody has any questions or comments with respect to any of the correspondence, Donna, go ahead.
I would just the PAC on SEAC, many of the resources are very good, and this one is actually, I'm taking a brief look at it. It's actually really got some good explanation about special education funding in it. And I had a discussion with a representative from the York District SEAC, and it was interesting to note, and because again, as we're talking about moving into election, and in October is the municipal elections, the trustee were running. One of the things that I found really interesting, and I mentioned this to Andrea, was that they actually SEAC provides training to new trustees, but new members, but they also make them do homework, and they have to submit their homework before they're allowed to attend a SEAC meeting, which I thought was really, really interesting. Across the board, because there is a lot of information as far as SEAC is concerned, and all education it has a lot of jargon. Special education has even more, and I thought it was interesting. But Andrea was talking about reaching out and see what that training. It's all in modules. Like, it's a list of modules that they have. It's all set up so they can, new members and so forth, can go through it on an individual basis, but there are questions and stuff that they have to answer in order to actually be successful at completing those modules. So I thought it was an interesting thought.
Senator Reneb, see your hand up?
I think Andrea wanted to respond. No? Okay.
I'll go after you.
My comment was about the calendar, and it may just be information I'm missing, But I did notice that the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, September 30th, we don't recognize that at the board, or do we?
We absolutely do. These are the instructional days of the calendar. So the days that the kids are in school are on the calendar, but our dates of significance are adjacent to this.
Okay.
And then may I comment? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think to Donna's point around how we support new members of SEAC, and we have a number of new committee members with Vera first night. And when I think of Clarissa and a few others that have joined us, and Donna Edgebean, maybe what we can do is once we get a few meetings in, we'll get the information from York. But I think those that are new to committee would have really important voice in saying what would have been more helpful to them in their transition to SEAC, and ability to amplify your voices by building a comfortable space for you in all of the gifts of your thinking. So if we can, maybe what we'll do is we'll get the information from York, but I think alongside that, really important to hear from our own SEAC in terms of what gaps were there for you as you started on SEAC, that we can do a better job of being supportive in order to amplify your voice.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, I agree. And I'd love to hear from Carissa and Vera and all of our recently joined members to see what gaps we can fill. If there's things that your information you're looking for, and sort of in the meantime, that we can sort of help mentor you on and make you feel more comfortable in sharing and participating in the group. I know initially I sat back and watched a lot just because I was learning what was happening, but please always feel free to reach out to any one of the SEAC members and myself for sure with any questions or anything you want to, quite frankly. Feel free to send me an email. Tara, I see your hand up.
Acronyms and jargon.
Yeah.
Just going to leave it at that.
Yes, acronyms and jargon. That's why I made a special point of talking about the special incidents portion. But yes, please, if there's anything that you're looking for in understanding what something is or what an acronym is or anything, for sure, please reach out and ask. And don't be afraid to just put your hand up and come out, and say, hey, what does that mean? Because, this is live streamed, and I'm sure there's a lot of times we use acronyms and without thinking, and the people watching us via YouTube may not know what those mean either. And so that question is really valuable. And I know I spent a lot of time writing acronyms down and looking them up later when I first joined. So please do. Donna, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just providing a comment of what York said, and I, for all means, absolutely, we need input on that. I didn't mean that it was something to come in and put out there, Andrea. It was just a comment on what they do, being a trustee for 12 years, I can honestly say that, people, particularly as far as trustees, there's a variety of experience that they bring in from their work experience, their family experience, their interactions with their schools. Special education, more than the rest of the education, has a lot of acronyms, and there's a lot to learn around funding. It took me a long time, even though that I was a parent of 2 children with special education needs. It became a different perspective when I sat on SEAC, on what all the things that were involved, and then even much more so when I became a trustee, how all the different things between funding and legislation and everything all fits in. It is constantly a learning experience, and every time, and as I said, even with new members, I always learn a lot more too, because from my perspective, case in point, my faux pas earlier, as far as, as again, I apologize around the pronunciation of the Indigenous names and asking that question. But it's a learning experience. And so value the input coming back from the new members on difficulties coming into SEAC.
Thank you. Okay, does anybody else have anything they want to add with respect to that? Okay, moving on then to community concerns. Do we have any community concerns to raise at the moment? No? Okay, then move on to our favorite spot, which is celebrations and successes. Does anybody have any celebrations or successes to share? Hmm? Okay, I have one, if nobody else has any. But my youngest has received 2 out of her 3 university acceptances, early acceptance, and 1 offering a scholarship. So we're very proud and very excited for her. So she's looking at going into a fine arts program and is very excited about it. So that's been a huge morale boost. Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have anything? No? Okay, well, our next SEAC meeting is February 17th, 2022, right here on Zoom. We just need a motion to adjourn. Tara, seconders? Sensor Renat, all in favor? Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you coming out. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.